don't go halfway around the world in uncharted territories over ocean trips and stuff to invade places where you don't know the local animals or the potential diseases and stuff because you hate people, because if you, or just because they're strangers, because then you can leave them alone, or you could hate them, you could avoid them. They went there and took us from there to where they were building an economy because they wanted our labor. Because labor creates value. They wanted the value created by stealing us and owning our bodies, our minds, and to the extent they could, our souls. They were able to benefit from every ounce of the labor that we created. You know, at some point it's ironic that somebody has ever called us a lazy people, because in fact, not only did we always feed and clothe and house ourselves, we also fed and clothed and housed those people that called us lazy. Because you know good and well, when a slave owner in a plantation was getting ready to get some more people from Maryland and Virginia, where they were breeding us so that they could be sold into the Delta area of Mississippi, the fresh new cotton lands of Texas, when they were coming down there, you know he sat around and said, well, wait a minute, I need to go out and plant some more food and build some houses so they have a nice place to go to. They probably didn't do that. In other words, the house that we ended up living in, the food we produced all of that, and all of the cotton that was picked. So the whole question of somebody's lazy, my God, it ain't us. We have to be producers, and we produce everything. There were some people worried about, we can't free the slaves, how will they feed themselves? The same way they fed themselves and you for all of the years you were holding them in bondage. So this is the world we live in, where value, wealth is created by labor, and yet a handful of people own it in such a way as to benefit from all of the surplus that's created. Everything that went beyond what it literally took to feed and put some raggedy clothes on people. And they had shoes, there were two sizes, too big and too small. Those were the only two sizes of those slave shoes came in. And literally, this is, you won't believe this, there was the kind of fabric that was woven in Rhode Island, in Providence, Rhode Island. And this is in the documentation from the Brown papers, where they were looking at Brown University's relationship to slavery. They said that they made a special fabric that was to be used for clothing for the enslaved people in the South, which was made out of a coarse blend of wool and linen intended to degrade the wearer. They deliberately, those are the special stuff they made. But okay, so given that, and given the hundreds of years that we worked under those conditions, given the following 100 years where we worked under the condition of semi-slavery through the sharecropping system, Jim Crow, and in the industrial exploitation, as the mechanization of agriculture led many of us to leave the South and go to the northern cities, living in the worst housing, the leftover housing from where other communities fled, sometimes piled up with unscrupulous banking and rental firms giving us, creating slums out of the condition of us struggling to have housing that was decent enough for our families. That was the condition that we had for another 100 years. Then shortly after the Voting Rights Act, we ended up electing a bunch of folk, and God bless the handful of the folk that we elected once we could elect folk that actually made a difference. I mean, Hank Sanders is one of the people I would hold up anywhere in terms of when they could make a difference. But heaven knows some of the Negroes that got elected after the Voting Rights Act had nothing to do with the struggle for voting rights or civil rights or anything else. And so many of the main beneficiaries, and this is partly connected with this weird way that we view education that made a lot of people think that the formal education that some privileged people had more qualified them to be those political leaders than the folk who were right there in their community. I mean, Fannie Lou Hamer should have been president. She should have gotten elected when she should have been governor of Mississippi. Those are the folk that we really needed. Instead, we build a whole other category, because sometimes we get infatuated by people's use of words and, well, they certified, they got degrees. But you got to understand that the whole worldwide educational system that is part of the world historical capitalist system, the purpose of it is to create the cadres, the leaders, who function inside the exploitative system worldwide and dominate the masses. And that level of preparation in those institutions affords you a certain level of privilege. So sometimes we seek that privilege for our children. We want our children to get a good job. What that good job means is fitting into a cog somewhere in the current exploitative system. And I want to say this to us as we talk about reparations. There is no real fairness and liberation and freedom for us inside of the existing social order in this country. It does not exist. It's not as though a certain amount of money will afford it. It's not as though a certain amount of education will inform it. I got into an argument once with Bob Moses about the algebra project, where he was saying, well, you know, learning algebra will allow you to enter into the mainstream of the American economy. I said, well, Bob, the mainstream of the American economy is sick. It is declining. It is moribund. It will die. There is no healthy economy to integrate us into. That's a reality that we have, and we have to start thinking about liberation in different terms. Not liberation within the confines or the forms of this system, but around creating a new system that is not based on the continuous accumulation of profit, the unending accumulation of profit. How do you have unending accumulation of anything on a finite planet? I mean, there's so much of everything. It's big. It's big. You fly over and see there's a lot of stuff down there. But almost every square inch you look down out of a place is owned by somebody. That's in the United States right now. And in some parts of the Midwest, you see these grid lines. Those are squares. Each square was a square mile. It was divided into fourths. Each quarter was a quarter of a square mile. And what 40 acres was a quarter of a quarter. That's what it was. A quarter of a quarter made it 1/16 of a square mile. That's 40 acres. And other people, someone mentioned at another point that they were afforded 160 acres. 160 acres was a quarter square. The 40 acres they talked about there was a quarter of a quarter. But 40 acres allowed you economic independence because on that amount of land, and for some folks who are not rural or not thinking about, you know, land size, a football field is about 1.3 acres. So 40 acres of land is like 30 football fields, all right? So you can grow enough food on 30 football fields to feed yourself, your family, and much of the neighborhood, and have a little surplus so you can buy some more music. Okay, so that was a productive thing, because when Sherman came up with General Order number 15, Special Field Order, he had just met in a church in Savannah, Georgia, with 20 African American ministers, many of whom had just ended up their servitude under slavery as the Union Army was coming down, others of whom had purchased their own freedom, sometimes at thousands of dollars. You got to understand, the brothers were saving up some money and working hard. At the point they took $1,000 back in 1865 was a whole lot of money. But they said there, he said, he asked them what they wanted. And he said, we would want land so that we would be able to produce for ourselves and be independent. Another question he asked, he said, well, would you want that land among white people or by yourself? 19 out of 20 said, we just soon be off by ourselves because these folks are so racist, we don't think they will ever act right. One of them was a brother from Baltimore who was the youngest person in the room. He said, I want to do it with them. But I just want you to know that part of our history is the reality of that. But we can talk, and we ought to be talking about how are we going to create not freedom in the far distant future, not the freedom that's dependent on the capitalist system reforming itself, not freedom based on white people changing their mind about us. And I will tell you all something, this got some young people mad at me the other day. I told them I couldn't care. I don't care what white people, even racist white people, even racist capitalists, I don't care what they think about me. I do care what they do. Now the difference, and the reason the distinction should be drawn is some of us actually care about what they think. I had an uncle, Uncle Bill, who wouldn't eat watermelon and fried chicken and bologna because he said that's what white people think he liked to eat. Well, if they think I'm going to eat some watermelon, they're right. I'm going to eat some watermelon every chance I get. I love it. And I don't care what they think. All right? So a lot of young folk are thinking now that, you know, all this white racism exists. These folk don't think us their equals. I could care less. What is important to us is, do we have or do we not have the opportunity to ourselves work to create the value that we need to meet our needs and elevate the quality of life in our communities. And if we have that, I could care less what anybody else in the world thinks at all. I don't even know what they think. I don't know. I don't care. It doesn't matter. Because what I'm talking about is our independence is connected with our capacity to meet our needs, elevate the quality of life. I want to say two more things. I want to mention a project in Greensboro, North Carolina, the RCC grocery store. 19-year food desert. People hadn't been able. A Winn-Dixie closed, moved out of the neighborhood. You know what happens. For 12 or 15 years, they were asking the city of Greensboro to help them. This is a working-class black neighborhood, to help them get a grocery store. The city talked to all kinds of developers who are interested in development only from the standpoint of how is it that I can leverage something, get a deal from the city, make a bunch of money, and guarantee this can be profitable, and maybe some social benefit will trickle down to the community. But that's what developers do. And we tell them, well, no, why don't you build your own store? So in November of 2016, about a $3 million grocery store opened up in that community now. And it was one of the coolest grand openings of a grocery store that people who work on grocery stores and cooperatives across the country said they've ever seen, because the community was largely committed to it. Now, we're still in the process of trying to get the sales up, because I don't want people to think this is an easy project. You open the store and instant profit, and no, it's a lot of hard work. We've had to get rid of one manager in the store in order to get, and now a couple of younger people who don't really have as much experience as we would probably otherwise like are functioning as a team, so we're having to work and train them. But this is the hard work we have to do, because our task is to create an economy that meets our needs and elevates the quality of life in our communities, and that we can do it, and we ought to start taking the surplus population that this system has created and the surplus value that this system has created and bring them together on some land somewhere so that people can grow the food they need to eat, have the housing they need to live in, and engage in creating meaning. And the kind of meaning creation I'm talking about is the songs that Rose was up here singing. It is the rituals that we can create when given a chance. Y'all know everybody think they're the next Jay-Z and Beyonce. They ought to be producing music. Do you know the actual tools and stuff required to do very, very high-level professional music production? Some of it's free right now. You have more equipment to work with than the Beatles had on any of their albums for free downloads. And if you get some of the stuff you can pay a few dollars for, you can put some young people you can put in the hands of some young people really, really elegant music production stuff, so that all of the ones that think they can be Beyonce and Jay-Z can, but they ought to be singing about something that has some meaning. That's why I am so sometimes concerned when I hear people who think that reparations will be, I'll get a check for a certain amount of money. I actually did the math one time, and the best I could come up with, if the United States were either to double the entire national debt and use that amount of money, they would be able to pay something like, I think it was like $40,000 per person, which again is enough money for folks to get part of a college education, a nice car, not a whole house. I mean, and the money's going to be spent. What we need is development opportunities. We need to recreate an opportunity so that those of us with entrepreneurial skills and courage can create businesses where we can make ourselves productive and produce for ourselves, because our potential for productivity is infinite, even though the resources we have to draw on from the earth are finite. And that's something that's worth thinking about for a minute. But we can continue to create and continue to create. We can create with the same resources more than once, because once it's created in one form, it can be transmitted and made into another one and another and another, and each one has value that is greater than the one before. So this is the world we're trying to work on. The Southern Reparations Loan Fund is an opportunity to create a lending situation where people engage in non-extractive finance, where the only money we get paid back for a loan we make will come out of the productivity of what you do, which is why we don't give loan money to just anybody, because some people have really bad ideas, and my job is to tell them, well, this isn't a good idea yet. You can't actually make any money with that. And so let's work on it until it gets to be a good idea, because there are some good ideas. There are some possibilities to be productive, and we just got to work on it. It's hard. It's hard. Capitalists already scarfed up all the easy stuff. And in the meantime, while we're building this ourselves, The capitalist system is sick and dying. It will collapse and die of its own weight. And the reason I know that is because every few years there's a daggum crisis. There's no reason for us to pretend these crises are not going to continue and to get caught up in that so that when it collapses, it falls on our head too. We ought to be about building opportunities and creating situations remote from that existing stuff so that they can be successful when the other stuff falls apart. And again, I'm out of town. I'm sorry I went a little over, but that's what I wanted to talk about, our economic life. And we need to get this money back into our community so we can do it with that.
All right.
All right.
Brother Ed, thank you very, very much. And he also spoke this afternoon and did fabulous. Hold on one second. I'd like to encourage everyone to come to the conference tomorrow, and this is only a taste of what you can get. And again, we're not trying to talk at you. We're trying to give you information that will encourage you to move. The theme of this convention this year is the fight for reparations. What do we have to gain? What do we have to gain? Brother just talked about self-reliance. How about that? The doctor was telling us about the disparities in health. If we become self-reliant, grow our own food, or at least buy food from people who grow their own food that look like us, we may not have to worry about going to the doctor. So I just want to say that to you. Sister Fire Rose has a couple of things to say. We're going to have our last presenter, which is Jumoke Ifetayo, and then we're going to wrap it up because we got a long day tomorrow, y'all, and it's hot.
Thank you. I was rushing there. Just two quick things I wanted to share in terms of education. Number one, reparation meetings. We use those. We bring in black historians and people could talk and actually teach the history. So when you sign people up, use that as a means to educate. That's the other thing. The second thing is, I wanted to start something. I think you call it hashtag.
Yes.
Hashtag Make Africa Great Again. I thought it was something we could do in a uniform way with everybody. So I wanted to suggest that we do a hashtag. They talk about Make America Great Again. They're talking about Make America Great Again for the white supremacists. Y'all know that. But I thought it would be good if we could adopt Make Africa Great Again. Hashtag Make Africa Great. Whoever knows how to do that, I would appreciate it. And the last thing is these symbols. Symbols are very powerful. In Montgomery, black children are forced to go to schools named after Robert E. Lee and Jeff Davis. I nearly cried. I went before the school board in Montgomery several times. I went again last month. I really had to hold back the tears because the black superintendent and the black board members looked at me like I was evil. But we have to make it a priority. People say, well, symbols are not important. How do you feel that they have sustained this racism and white supremacy? Symbols. First thing they did when they went to Iraq, what did they do? They tore down the statue of Hussein. But we allow these statues to remain. Don't dismiss these as being irrelevant. They're very, very relevant symbols. So I engage you if there's an effort in your town to remove some of these negative symbols, do it. Alabama just passed a law last month. My husband couldn't stop it. He's in the state senate. The law says if you try to change the name of any of these people, it is a crime. They made it a crime to change the name or to remove any monument that's over 40 years old. They are determined to keep their symbols because they cannot sustain white supremacy without it.
All righty. Brother Jumoke.
I'm going to take follow the lead of these other presenters and take a seat right here. Free the land.
Free the land. Free the land.
Free the land.
Free the land.
By any means necessary. I bring you greetings on behalf of the Provisional Government of the Republic of New Africa. I was thinking about as I was working on the committee to help to put this program together, and I feel like we really chose some very dynamic people that have the knowledge base and experience to speak about their area. We had a medical doctor to speak on health. We had the sister did a great job on criminal punishment. She presented some good information. We had Mama Faya Toure, who's a long-term activist and has done a lot of work around education disparities in Selma. She's created a museum, after-school programs you heard her talk about, Saturday programs, and many, many things. Very much qualified to speak on the issue of education. We had Brother Ed Whitfield, who has spent a lot of work around economic development and has looked at different creative ways to address that issue. So when we were putting these people together, then we had to deal with Peoplehood, Nationhood, and didn't really have a name for that, a person for that, right? So I said, and James said in one of the meetings, he said, I need some of the board members to step up if, we have some vacancies. So I said, well, I can fill that vacancy. But when I thought about it, just now before I came up, I was thinking about the fact that who do we have in our community that's really an expert who could speak on peoplehood, nationhood? I mean, we would need to think about somebody who, I don't know, who maybe worked with the founding of South Sudan recently, a new nation that just came into existence. I don't know, help me out as to who would be a good person that has experience in nation building right now. You got somebody in camp? Well, that's still more theoretical. I mean, he has some good ideas, but I'm talking about experience in nation building, peoplehood, nation building. So I'm going to fulfill that, person that needed to speak on that position, but I really wanted us to think about that's a real challenge that we have to work on, is this whole question of nation building and nationhood. So as it relates to reparations, I like to share this story sometimes with people. A lot of times when I talk about reparations, sometimes people will say, when we talk about going back to Africa, or when we talk about having our own nation state, people will say, well, I don't want to go nowhere. We built this nation. And I said, okay, I can accept that. But so I always have to try to think about analogies or stories I think that maybe could help to illustrate certain things. So let's just say someone contracts with you to build their house, right? To build their house on their property that they own. And even when we say contract, we're using that loosely if we want to talk about slavery and we want to talk about, post-slavery, even when our labor was exploited, all right, Brother Ed? So, but let's just say they contract with you to build their house the way they want their house built on their property, right? So after the house is finished, you wouldn't expect them to give you the keys so you have access to their house, right? It's their house on their property built the way they want it. What that person owes you is the wages for the work that you did on their house. You take that money and you go into your own space and get some property. In this case, this analogy is your own nation, as Ed laid out when we talked about the 40 acres and a mule. We go and build your own house with the resources that was given to you for those wages, and you build your own house in your own nation, or build your own house, which is your own nation. So then I said, well, let's go a little bit deeper. I like to play around with these analogies. So I said, well, we like to protest and march and stuff a lot. So let's say, okay, so he doesn't give you the keys to the house, and you don't have access to his house. So you're upset about it. So you organize some of your friends and y'all have a protest in front of his house, embarrass him, right? And so he says, well, okay, I'll tell you what. I'll let you come and visit, but these are my rules. Because it's my house, I'm going to set the rules in my house, right? So you can't drink in my house. So that's one of the rules. So he invites you over to a party, and your son goes down in the basement with his son and starts drinking. And so he calls the police, right? Because you violated his law. Of course, his son is drinking, which is fine, right? Nothing's going to happen to his son. But, you know, so we have to really think critically about this idea that we built this country and it belongs to us because we built this country. We contributed labor and our blood, sweat, and tears. Well, I don't say what we have to do, I have to be careful. What I would like us to consider is building our own nation. This work has begun since, really before slavery ended. And it continues in one formation. It continues in the form of the Provisional Government of the Republic of New Africa. And we're very serious about moving this idea forward of us having our own nation. And NCOBRA has always asserted there's basically 3 roads that you can choose along the reparations path. One is you can go back to Africa. 2, and we say go back to Africa with resources, because you don't just jump on a plane and go to Africa. Go back to Africa with the reparations that we deserve so that we can build schools and hospitals and communities, new communities over there. We can have our own nation state, or we can stay within the United States and kind of work it out. So when we talk about restitution as one of the 5 forms of reparations, as was talked about earlier today, we understand that part of the United Nations definition of reparations is how do we restore, how are people restored to the place, to a way before the harm happens. Is that right, Ken? Restitution. We came from communities, nations, so part of that would have to be us having our own nation. Can I get a clap on that? Can I get an I say on that?
I say.
So it just makes sense if we're talking about, and again, I think, Brother Ed, made some very good points. It just makes sense that we have to create the systems and structure our reparations in such a way that we can have the best opportunity to perpetuate it, non-repetition. Because again, if we're staying in this country, we're really setting ourselves up for failure. So one of those things that we can do is have our own nation state or go back to Africa with resources. Peoplehood, nationhood also includes restoring us in terms of our language. We talked about some of that also earlier today. Our culture, our spirituality, our traditional ways of being. I talk about sometimes with people, when I talk about reparations, I say, to me, reparations would mean us not having any prisons. And again, I don't know what would happen in this country, but again, in our nation state, we can use some, what I consider best practices. As we create this nation, the Republic of New Africa, let's look at what are some of the best practices around the world. What nations have the best healthcare model? What nations have the best systems of policing their community? What countries have the best economic system structures so that there's less inequality economically? And we could draw on these systems that already exist and incorporate them into our nation and create our nation at a very high level. We have the benefit of looking at what's worked over the last 50 years, 100 years in different nations and bringing that to bear as we create our own nation state. I remember one time I was on the radio Black Talk Radio in Atlanta, and somebody called in and said, I was talking about reparations, of course, and somebody called in, and a woman called in and said, we live in a capitalist society. All we need to do is we just need to teach our children how to make money. And I thought about it for a second. I said, okay, but we don't make money in this country. We earn money. There's a distinction. Making money is when you print money. When you mint money. When we put Harriet Tubman or Marcus Garvey or whoever we choose to, Mario Belli, on our money, on our currency, that's making money. That's what we need to do. We need to position ourselves where we create our own currency. I think about it also from the perspective of, a few people of African descent that went through the same situation we went through in, say, like Jamaica or Barbados or Cuba or Guyana. They figured it out, right? They figured out how to create their own nation. We can do the same. We must do the same. We have so much skill set. There's more people of African descent going to school in Atlanta alone than in some whole countries in Africa, than some whole countries in the Caribbean. We have a skill set that's so high. I would say, like, for example, we have people of African descent who have worked on the space program. When the astronauts get off the space shuttle, the doctor that they go see is a woman, an African-American woman, Dr. Patricia Cowles. And I just use that as an example because, we may not want to invest money, waste money on a space program. But what I'm saying is that we have highly trained, talented people because we've been in this country, such that we, again, would have the best opportunity to create that type of nation that would rival any other nation in the world because we have the resources and we have the mind and skill sets that many countries don't even have, that we have by being in this country. So, I invite you to consider supporting the demand for our nation state as a part of this reparations work that we do. I invite you to consider finding out more about the Provisional Government of the Republic of New Africa. It was birthed March 31st in 1968. Baba General Rashid there, who was our elder historian in NCOBRA and the Republic of New Africa, was actually there to sign the Declaration of Independence. He was the 99th signer of the Declaration of Independence, of our Declaration of Independence. And we're so blessed to have him still with us today and his contributions. He just turned, I don't know if you want me to tell people, he just turned 80 in December. And we're, again, thankful for his contribution and his, as Mama Faya said earlier, that his persistence and consistency.
I was at that meeting with
and you were at that meeting with him, yes.
You were too young.
We give thanks. And so, and I mentioned that because we're coming up on the 50th anniversary of the Provisional Government of the Republic of New Africa. So we're going back to the birthplace of the Republic of New Africa in Detroit. And we're excited. We're excited to bring these elders back to the table and honor them for that bold, courageous move to say we can have our own nation state and to begin to move out on that. You know, when I got more involved in the Republic of New Africa, I realized why the Provisional Government of the Republic of New Africa is so important. It's important because in order to be recognized by the United Nations, there's only about 3 things you have to do. You have to identify your people. So we say people of African descent, the 40 million plus of us that lives here in the United States. All right. Then you have to identify your landmass, your specific territory. So we identified, or they identified, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana as the landmass. And then the third criteria is you have to have a government. That makes sense, because in order for you to interface with other nations of the world, you have to have a government. I mean, you obviously have to have a government for your own self-governance, but to operate with and be recognized as a nation by other governments in other nations in the world, you have to have your own government. So the Provisional Government Republic of New Africa was birthed at that time because they understood the importance of that. And we still understand the importance of that today. And so March 31st will be in Detroit. We will honor the sacrifices of our ancestors and those who are still alive to bring forward this movement, this notion of us having our own nation state. And Peoplehood, Nationhood is, we made sure that NCOBRA put that in our 5 injury areas. Because actually NCOBRA was birthed out, some people would say was birthed out of the Provisional Government of the Republic of New Africa. And because we knew that people may gravitate more to reparations, quicker to reparations than they would gravitate to us having our own nation state. But we were always put, as I said, within those 3 roads, and NCOBRA always understood the importance of making sure that nation state and nationalism was a part of our reparations demand. You know, a lot of times people say, well, we get reparations, they had mentioned this too, we'll just spend it, we'll just give it right back. But if we're including reparations in the form of our own nation state, we ain't spending that. We ain't giving that right back. And I just kind of close with this. I think that sometimes people say, well, you know, how would we go about that? How would we do that? And I invite you to consider history. If you study the history of any nation, it was armed struggle that brought them into existence, but it was also another key thing that we don't often talk about was alliance with other nations. Alliance with other nations. If we listen to, you know, the story, the lies that they tell us even just about this country, right? That they were fighting the British, but they were able to get the French to work with them in alliance. So we have to partner and make alliances with other nations. That will be the enforcement that we will have when we fight and make our demand and move forward into our own nation state. So that is possible when you think about countries like China and other countries that will support us in that demand. There was a time before most of the African nations got their independence where people of African descent in this country, we supported their independence movements. My father's nickname in high school was a Mau Mau because as a high school student, he organized in New York City around sending support to the Mau Mau movement. We brought about the nation of Kenya. But we did that for Ghana, we did that for Nigeria, we did that for many other nations. So now is the time to call on them, right, to support us on our quest for having an independent nation state. And so I will leave it there. I don't know if we're going to take questions or not for, I think, all of the panelists. I'm not sure. Well, I'm just going to turn it over to the moderator. And I thank you for your time. I thank you for listening. I thank you for supporting NCOBRA. And again, we invite you to come out to Detroit. We're probably going to start some activities around Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Bill. But it's going to be a very powerful and meaningful gathering at our 50th anniversary of the Provisional Government of the Republic of New Africa. Asante Sana. Free the land. 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 By any means necessary.
Right. Thank you for that, Brother Jumoke. Brother Shabaka, you had a question?
Yeah, you had a question, right? You had a question there.
Okay.
All right, where you going, man? I got a question.
The nation state is a relatively new concept. We had kingdoms, you know.
Sure.
All right, but I want you to expand on that in this sense. We know that we had various communities throughout the U.S. that developed, and then they were attacked. All right, so I want you to expand on Pan-Africanism. Are you listening? Pan-Africanism, which is a coordinated union with African territories as a form of protection against other nations with larger population and land mass, all right, to sustain your state, what you call the nation state.
Our state.
Our state. Our state.
But if I'm understanding your question, we will call on, as I said earlier, those nation states. And I agree with you. And again, as we continue to evolve, that's another whole process. We continue to incorporate our African traditions and our African heritage and bringing it forward as well. But right now, that is the construct that is most acknowledged and respected in the world, is this nation-state concept. So we'll work on that, and then as we evolve, it might transition into something else. But we definitely intend to continue to build alliances with these other nations in support of our nationhood. Did I answer your question? Or?
No, not really, but that's
All right.
I'll talk to you tomorrow. I got orders to talk to you tomorrow.
All right. So yeah, if you have questions of me, we can have those vibrations at another time.